You're gonna get one.
The following announcement has been paid for by the New World Order.
When Scott Hall and Kevin Nash made the jump from the WWF to WCW in 1996, the wrestling world got turned upside down. Razor Ramon and Big Daddy Cool Diesel had been key players in Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Federation, garnering a huge amount of fan support during the WWF's New Generation movement, and losing two of these big names to the opposition, World Championship Wrestling, was a huge blow to the company. No one could have predicted the impact that Nash and Hall would make in WCW. The two men had worked for World Championship Wrestling previously with limited success, but this time it was very, very different. Billed as the Outsiders, the former Razor Ramon and Diesel would usher in a new era in WCW, kickstarting the company's most groundbreaking and lucrative storyline in history. Today's video looks at the WCW debut of the Outsiders. Razor Ramon was the first guy to reach out and try to get a deal with WCW. Razor had been an excellent Intercontinental Champion in the World Wrestling Federation and a big fan favourite too, but he wanted to earn more money within wrestling. Scott had asked Vince McMahon if he could get a pay raise or even if he could work some dates in Japan to try and earn a little more on the side. Both ideas were shot down by Vince. Scott Hall was good friends with Diamond Dallas Page, and when DDP learned that Scott's contract was coming up with the World Wrestling Federation and Scott wanted to potentially earn more money, Dallas spoke to Eric Bischoff and a lucrative offer was made to bring Razor Ramon to WCW. Scott Hall said, "I went to Vince McMahon and asked if I could improve my situation with the company. I didn't want to leave, but at that time, Vince felt no. Vince couldn't accommodate me the way I wanted to be accommodated, so I had to do what I felt was best for my family, and that was to accept an offer from WCW. It goes back to what Chief Jay Strongbow said to me, in this business you can make friends or you can make money. I looked at Kevin and I looked at Kid, I've already made friends, I'd like the money." So Scott Hall worked his final WWF date on the 19th of May 1996, putting Triple H over before the infamous curtain call incident in Madison Square Garden, and someone else who also worked his final match on this very date was Big Daddy Cool Diesel. Diesel had been the WWF champion during most of 1995. The WWF had ran on Diesel power for a little while. Big Daddy Cool had been billed as the leader of the WWF's New Generation, and he was a cornerstone of the WWF's movement to get away from superstars of the past during the mid-90s. Kevin was good friends with Scott. He was also good friends with the 1-2-3 Kid, Triple H and Shawn Michaels, and when Scott told Kevin how much WCW had offered him, Big Daddy Cool instantly wanted a piece of the pie. Kevin said, "Scott pulled me aside and he said he got an offer to work for Turner. I asked him how much and he told me. I asked him for how many days and he said 150. I said, what? It was huge money and it was guaranteed money, so I got on the phone. Dallas Page was kind of brokering the deal. Eric didn't want to be seen as interfering or talking to us. I went through Dallas and they made an offer to me. So I talked to Vince. I said, this is the offer they gave me. I want to stay. If you can match the offer, I'll stay." Vince McMahon said that both Kevin and Scott were willing to take a little less on their WCW offer, but the WWF would have to guarantee their income, and Vince McMahon didn't offer guaranteed money during this time frame. Vince would say he doesn't offer guarantees, but he does offer opportunities. This wasn't enough to keep Razor Ramon and Diesel on the WWF books though. The two men decided to leave, and Diesel had his last match in Madison Square Garden also on May 19th, 1996, losing to WWF champion Shawn Michaels in a steel cage match. After the bout, the curtain call incident took place. The Clique broke kayfabe in the middle of the ring to give Scott and Kevin an emotional send-off to WCW. Vince McMahon later admitted that if he knew the impact Kevin Nash and Scott Hall would have on the WCW vs WWF Monday Night War, then he would have offered them enough money to stay put. WCW executive producer Eric Bischoff had been studying Japanese wrestling during the early to mid 90s, and he had become enamoured with the UWF vs New Japan invasion angle throughout 1995 and early 1996. When WCW had secured Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, two of the WWF's biggest stars, Eric felt he could reenact some key aspects of the UWF vs New Japan storyline when it was time for both men to make their television debuts. Eric said, "In the United States, the WWF and WCW were really having a hard time in the live event side of things, while in Japan, they were putting 60, 80, 100,000 people in the Tokyo Dome for big shows. To sum it up, I was over there kind of studying what worked and the differences between the way the product was presented in Japan in comparison to the States. One of the things I noticed, it was much more real there. The storylines, the characters, the action in the ring was more reality based. Here in the United States it was more about characters and comedy. In Japan I was watching the intercompany wars, that kind of thing, and that's where the NWO idea started. Scott became available, Kevin became available, and that loose idea I had from studying Japan became kind of a reality." The May 27th, 1996 episode of Nitro was remarkable for two things. Firstly, this episode of Nitro was the first 2-hour broadcast of WCW's flagship show, a move here that would eventually force the WWF to also move to a 2-hour format down the road. Secondly, Scott Hall made his debut on this very same episode of Monday Nitro. During a match pitting The Mauler against Steve Dahl, Scott Hall appeared from the audience, making his way down to the ring to interrupt this match. The way this was booked was perfect. Scott Hall got in the ring and said one of the most infamous quotes in wrestling history when he said, "You people, you know who I am.
But you don't know why I'm here."
Scott went on to ask where Billionaire Ted and the Nacho Man were. These were names the WWF used to mock Ted Turner and Randy Savage, and this is important when looking back at this promo. Scott was using terms that the World Wrestling Federation had been using to poke fun at WCW, so by using these names, Scott himself was also making fun of World Championship Wrestling. Scott said that he can go wherever he wants, whenever he wants, before ending his promo by saying,
"You want to go to war? You want a war? You're going to get one."
What's never really talked about here is how Tony Schiavone reacted on commentary after Scott Hall's promo. Randy Anderson, the referee from the match that Scott Hall had interrupted, got on the apron and asked Scott to leave. Tony Schiavone could be heard asking Randy what was going on, adding a sense of realism to the segment and that feeling of this wasn't supposed to happen. Tony then said that it looks like the match had been cancelled before apologising to fans before going off to commercial break. Schiavone doesn't really get credit for this, and I think he definitely helped add a sort of surreal feeling to the whole thing. He helped portray what WCW and Eric Bischoff were trying to present here for sure. Scott Hall wasn't done though. The former Razor Ramon promised us all that he would speak with Eric Bischoff before the end of the night. Bischoff took over on commentary for the second hour of Nitro, and to end the broadcast, Scott Hall approached Eric at the commentary table. Scott told Eric Bischoff that Billionaire Ted should find 3 of his top guys to take on Scott Hall and some of his friends, but there was no mentioning of who Scott's friends could be. Scott kept saying things like, "We are going to take over," and while Eric Bischoff would ask Scott who he was referring to, Scott wouldn't give Eric any answers. Hall said the war should take place in the ring, not in the dirt sheets. It should be a match inside the squared circle where it matters. The Nitro broadcast ended with Eric Bischoff and Bobby Heenan looking at each other, totally lost for words. Again, it was played off really well by the broadcast team, and like Tony Schiavone earlier on, I don't think these guys get enough credit for their reactions to Scott Hall's WCW debut and these threats of a takeover. The very next week, Nitro ended the same way when Scott Hall interrupted Eric Bischoff at the commentary desk. Scott said it was Eric Bischoff who started this war, but Hall and his friends are going to finish it. This was in regards to the creation of Nitro, by the way. Scott was trying to say that Eric Bischoff fired the first shots by going head to head with Raw, and so Scott and what we could only assume were some of his WWF buddies were going to shut WCW up for good. Hall was implying he was still with the WWF here, by the way. The key word though is implying. Never once did Scott say he and the WWF were going to take over WCW, but his use of names like Scheme Gene and Nacho Man, along with his threats to bring a war to WCW and Scott himself sounding exactly like Razor Ramon, all of this was scripted to make it seem like Scott was bringing a fight to WCW from the WWF. Anyway, Sting interrupted Scott Hall here on Nitro while defending the honour of WCW. Scott Hall threw a toothpick at Sting, a classic Razor Ramon move, and Sting replied with a slap to the face. Enraged, Scott said he has a big surprise next week on Nitro for both Eric Bischoff and the Stinger. So let's move on to the June 10th WCW Nitro, the episode before the Great American Bash, and an interesting week indeed when talking about the Outsiders. When he was once again interrupted by Scott Hall, Eric Bischoff asked where the big surprise was. Kevin Nash then walked into frame. Big Daddy Cool Diesel had arrived in WCW. Kevin Nash's promo here was great, by the way, but it's remembered for a botch. Kevin Nash said to Eric Bischoff,
This is where the big boys play, huh? Look at the adjective, play. We ain't here to play.
Yeah, a small hiccup there that didn't go unnoticed. But anyway, Kevin said that WCW should get to work dusting off some fossils to get ready for the war. Eric Bischoff then delivered a classic bait and switch. Eric said he has a meeting with WCW executives in Atlanta the following day, and he will see if the higher-ups will allow three guys to bring the fight at the Great American Bash pay-per-view. Of course, the hostile takeover wouldn't happen at the Great American Bash. WCW were going to milk this one a little while longer, but something else happened at the Great American Bash that is very important. The WWF had forced Kevin Nash and Scott Hall legitimately to declare they were not representatives of the World Wrestling Federation. How did the WWF manage to do this? Well, WCW had gotten word that Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation were going to try and sue WCW. When Scott Hall came over to WCW, his mannerisms, his voice, even the way he walked, it was a carbon copy of his Razor Ramon character from the WWF. Vince McMahon owned both the Razor Ramon and Diesel characters, from the names to the entrance music, the likeness, the rights. The WWF owned everything that was Razor Ramon and Diesel, except Scott Hall and Kevin Nash themselves. So over on WCW here, we have Scott Hall walking out talking with his Cuban Razor Ramon accent, talking about the Nacho Man and Scheme Gene in a WWF-esque manner, saying he was going to bring a war to WCW that Eric Bischoff instigated with the debut of Monday Nitro and WCW's rivalry with the WWF. Vince McMahon didn't take too kindly to this. Vince felt that Eric was using the Razor Ramon and Diesel gimmicks that he owned in order to gain an advantage over the WWF by presenting this invasion angle. Of course, Razor Ramon and Diesel were not sent by the WWF at all, but WCW had been implying this whole time that the duo were representing the World Wrestling Federation. To get this settled and to try and stop the whole angle completely, the WWF took WCW to court, accusing Turner's wrestling organisation of defamation, slander, trademark infringement, and unfair competition. As part of the complaint, the WWF sought an immediate temporary restraining order against further use of Scott Hall and Kevin Nash in ways that could deceive or confuse wrestling fans into thinking the World Wrestling Federation was affiliated with this ongoing WCW storyline. So basically, Vince McMahon was trying to stop the NWO storyline from happening. The case dragged on, but the knee-jerk reaction from Eric Bischoff and WCW was to have Kevin Nash and Scott Hall come out at the Great American Bash pay-per-view and admit to the world that they were actually not representing the World Wrestling Federation. Point blank, Eric asked both men, "Do you work for the WWF?" and both men said no. Here's another interesting fact. Part of the eventual settlement terms of this very lawsuit would give the WWF the right to bid on WCW properties should they ever be up for liquidation. This means, in a roundabout way, the NWO was the reason why Vince McMahon was able to purchase WCW. Anyway, both companies were able to settle out of court. There's much more to this lawsuit and we could literally talk for hours about it, so let's move on. WCW were not allowed to mention that any future NWO members were previously hired by the World Wrestling Federation, leading to the WWF trying and failing to get the last laugh with the fake Razor Ramon and fake Diesel characters on WWF television, a shining example of Vince McMahon's pettiness here. Ironically, when it was announced that Razor and Diesel would return to the WWF just before we were introduced to these fake versions, Scott and Kevin got a pay rise in WCW. Hall and Nash were signed to what was known in WCW as deal memos, pretty much a preliminary contract that outlines the legalities of the working agreement between the company and the worker, but signing a deal memo isn't the same as signing your final contract. Hall and Nash could, in theory, return to the WWF at any time before their legitimate final contracts had been signed. So when the WWF said that Razor and Diesel would return on television, WCW panicked, pushing more money in the faces of Nash and Hall in order to expedite the signing of their final WCW contracts. So Vince McMahon's pettiness over the Razor and Diesel characters actually led to the real Kevin Nash and Scott Hall getting paid more money in WCW. It's truly an unbelievable and remarkable tale of Vince McMahon constantly shooting himself in the foot. The real Razor Ramon and Diesel would use their real names in WCW, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash respectively, and the WWF couldn't really stop WCW from going ahead with the storyline as long as WCW didn't exploit the fact that Hall and Nash, along with the whole NWO, were former WWF guys. At the Great American Bash then, the Outsiders would not have a match. As previously mentioned, Eric asked both Hall and Nash if they worked for the WWF, both men said no. Eric then said that 3 WCW guys would face Hall, Nash and their third mystery partner at Bash at the Beach 1996, but Hall and Nash got pissed off when Eric wouldn't reveal who would represent WCW in the 6-man tag. Eric ended up taking a jackknife powerbomb to end the segment. Mean Gene Okerlund announced the next night on Monday Nitro that Sting, Lex Luger and Randy Savage would be the 3 men representing WCW at Bash at the Beach. Nash and Hall, now known as the Outsiders, were still a man down though, and I'm not going to go into great detail here regarding Hulk Hogan, by the way. It's already been covered and you guys, I'm sure, all know the story. But the big question leading up to Bash at the Beach now was, who is this mystery third partner who would be siding with Hall and Nash? Again, you guys know the story, but let's wrap things up here and focus on what the Outsiders got up to right before the Bash at the Beach pay-per-view. On the June 24th edition of Nitro, we had a good triple team tag match, the Steiners versus Harlem Heat versus Lex Luger and Sting. Towards the end of the match, the Outsiders made their way to the ring through the audience. A bunch of security guys stormed the ring to make sure Hall and Nash couldn't interfere in the main event, but the damage was already done. The Outsiders had pretty much put an end to the Nitro main event, bringing WCW's flagship show to a complete standstill. Hall and Nash bought tickets to the July 1st, 1996 episode of Nitro, meaning WCW security were unable to throw the Outsiders out of the building. The guys couldn't help themselves though. Hall and Nash grabbed a microphone and started patronising Eric Bischoff. As the outsiders were approaching the commentary table, the WCW locker room emptied. Babyfaces and heels, who would normally be squaring off against each other, all came out to ensure Hall and Nash couldn't get any closer. Eventually, security got rid of the outsiders, and the show ended with the security guys forcing Hall and Nash to get in their car and leave the arena. That Sunday, the hostile takeover was booked for Bash at the Beach. Hall and Nash had their very first match since returning to WCW, and history was made when Hulk Hogan joined the Outsiders and the New World Order was born. And so, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall had ushered in a new era for WCW, an era based on Eric Bischoff's vision, and an era that changed the course of professional wrestling itself. I don't think I need to explain how important the New World Order was to wrestling in the 90s. The Outsiders would become one of WCW's most successful tag teams, capturing the tag titles 6 times while gaining a huge fan following, thanks to how WCW presented the New World Order as cool villains. After some time, Shawn Michaels and Triple H formed their own tag team that, when you think about it, really did have a lot of similarities when comparing to the Outsiders. Both teams included members of the Clique, both teams were heels but they got cheered for being rebellious, and both teams used their backstage stroke to further their own standing within the company. People today call this a bad thing, and maybe it is, but when you talk about producing results, setting legitimate trends and breaking new ground, well, both the Outsiders and the original D-Generation X done all of these things. The Outsiders, however, maybe struggled with longevity, but that's something we can look at in another video. Something I did take away here though when watching this all back was how WCW completely altered their presentation when Hall and Nash would make appearances just to make it feel real. I watch a lot of old WCW Nitro episodes and these things may appear subtle to your average viewer, but commentators would immediately change their tone when talking about Hall and Nash. Pre-recorded videos about completely unassociated wrestlers would end abruptly if the Outsiders made an appearance. WCW even used camera angles that were never used before when Hall and Nash showed up. We saw more of the arena, we saw things that weren't part of the regular broadcast, and these subtle changes made a huge difference. Look out for this if you decide to go back and relive this time period in WCW. Anyway, thanks for checking out this video on the Outsiders, and hopefully you have a better understanding of Nash and Hall's first few weeks within World Championship Wrestling. I haven't even begun scratching the surface with Kevin Nash and Scott Hall in WCW, but rest assured both men's time in the NWO will get covered in the future.
The following announcement has been paid for by the New World Order.